story, and this is not a fairy tale, it actually is history, took place. There were 3 families, and the total was 13 people, 7 adults and 6 children, and they were running for their lives. Now, they had apparently huddled together in a little shelter, and they were hoping to ride out this hail of rocks that was coming down from the sky. So you have a hail of rocks coming down, they're huddled in a shelter, but now, suddenly, there's a new terror that they need to run from, and it is like a thick, suffocating ash that starts to come down from the sky. So now they cannot stay in this shelter, but they need to run. So they start running. In the lead was probably a servant man. He had a bag of provisions over his shoulder. He's followed by 2 boys, one 4 years old, the other 5 look like, and they're running hand in hand. The others were following behind, panic-stricken, struggling, stumbling, trying to escape. But each time they took a deep breath, instead of air, they would get that thick, choking ash that they would breathe in. One by one, all of them fell. All 13, motionless, laying along, and their remains would become entombed, where they could be found by archaeologists 2,000 years later and decipher the final events of their lives. These 13 victims were only a few of the estimated 16,000 that perished August 24th, 79 CE on the ancient city of Pompeii, Italy. Now, when I say Pompeii, of course, it is familiar to most. They recognize that name connects with Mount Vesuvius, which erupted. And all those people lost their lives. Those who mainly delayed and lost their lives were wealthy people who did not want to leave their homes and their possessions. And so they were buried under 20 feet of rock and ash. Now, what happened there in Pompeii 2,000 years ago, though it may be, has great significance for our day. And that's the reason why we start out this discussion this morning with that story of what actually took place in that city. You see, there is a coming destruction, and survival is possible. But in order to survive, we need to act. Delay can be deadly. And so that's what we need to discuss. How is it that we can move when it's time to move? How can we act when it's time to act and not allow delay, stagnation to bring us to ruin? Now, disasters have always taken place. That's 2,000 years ago. We are very familiar with various disasters. There was the tsunami back in 2004. Hurricane Katrina might come to mind. Since time memorial, people have witnessed these events, and many have actually connected them with God. They said that they are due to God's displeasure with man. Some have looked at it as a sign of heaven's displeasure. Maybe along with an earthquake comes a change in a dynasty, like in China. And so, because of this, they can say, oh, this is God trying to change things because he's not happy with the way things are going. People have even termed such catastrophic events as acts of God. You might have heard that expression. Think about that expression. Acts of God. In a sense, it's almost as if it's holding God responsible for these disasters, indirectly blaming God for these calamities. When disasters strike, people often will cry out against God. But the question is raised, is it God who is responsible for catastrophes that take place? How do you view the matter? Well, although throughout Bible times and even into modern times there have been disasters, the Bible foretells them, but it does not mean that they are caused by God. Jesus prophesied in the system of things, there would be food shortages, earthquakes, pestilences. John, in his visions and revelation, described food shortages, deadly plague. Does this mean that God caused such events to take place? Well, God, being all-knowing, he can see where mankind's endeavors are heading, but it does not mean that he causes them. There are three reasons why we can say that every time a disaster comes about, it's not because of God. Here's three reasons. You can mark these down if you want to mark down three reasons why we know that they are not caused by God. The first reason: humans often misuse natural resources or abuse the environment, and thus making it more prone to a disaster. I'll give you a fine example of that right in my own hometown, Scranton, Pennsylvania. Now, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, we have different neighborhoods, and the names of the neighborhoods tell you a lot about them. I'll give you an example. One section we call the Flats. Another section we call the Plot. Now, stop and ask yourself logically, do you think that's a good place to build your house? Some place that people have called the Plot? Why do they name it that? Well, it's because the place where that section is lower than the river level. So it's kind of like the plot. I mean, usually when you think of a plot, you think of like a funeral or like a cemetery, right? A plot. But yet people have their homes built in this section called the plot. And when we lived there, well, we've been there 20 years, but I remember back in maybe like 94, 95, it would flood almost annually, and always in the plot. And the hill section would look down on the plot and see the flooding, see all the people in their boats, moving their stuff out. Some would actually even replace washers and dryers annually to go along with the flooding. Now, how is that God? If you keep on rebuilding in the same spot that you know is going to flood again. Oh, it didn't flood this year. Whew, dodged a bullet. You know it's going to flood next year, right? Is that a good place to build? No, that's not a smart place to put your house. It's going to keep flooding. Now, another, and that was really the second thing, it says the way people live makes them more vulnerable when disasters strike. So that's another example of how it's really not God to blame. Now, I'm going to share with you a story on that one. And this one is from May 18th, 1980. So that's current. Most of us were alive in 1980. Those of you who were not alive yet, trust me, it's a date that most of us do remember who were alive. Because in May 18th, 1980, there was a man named Harry Truman who lived on Mount St. Helens. And Harry Truman had always lived on this mountain all his life. And so they told him, you need to move because the mountain is giving signs like there's a disaster coming. It's belching steam and we smell sulfur in the air. You need to get out of there. Harry Truman said, I'm not going anywhere. I've always lived here. I'm not moving. When the explosion came, ash and hot gases were hurled from the mountain at 200 miles an hour. See, now it's too late to decide, okay, maybe I will move. There were some people who had gone to the mountain to get pictures because they had never seen it spurting off, steam and things like this before. So they wanted to get pictures. Would you believe some people died with their cameras up to their eyes? That's how fast it happened. It's too late then. There were people who were driving around roadblocks to get up closer, and the helicopter would come and try to wave them away. Get out of here, because he sees the lava flowing away from the mountain. And you know what they did? They waved them away. Get out of here, we're all right. How can you know more than a helicopter? He's up in the air. You're down on the ground. But you see, this is a foolish problem that people have. Many times they will ignore warnings if it's something they're not familiar with. I never saw that before. not in my category of experiences, so don't bother me, you know. That's a problem. Many times, we have to listen to warnings. Finally, the third reason, many people ignore warnings, making the results more destructive. So these three reasons are why we can say that they are not acts of God. God is not the cause. All right, so let's spend most of our time today then discussing what are actual acts of God. Let's first look at something about Jehovah God in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 4. And let's find out something about our Heavenly Father that will help us to determine a true act of God. Deuteronomy 32 and verse 4. This is what it says about our God. The rock, perfect is his activity, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness with whom there is no injustice. Righteous and upright is he. That's what we know about our God. He's a just God. So for it to be a true act of God, it would have to qualify in three different ways. You can mark these down, and this way you can always determine if something is an act of God. Number one, they are in harmony with God's purpose. Number two, they are preceded by advance warning. And finally, number three, they are accompanied by divine directions for survival. So keep those three in mind as we go through a couple of real acts of God. One, harmony with God's purpose. Two, and three, accompanied by divine directions for survival. So let's consider the first act of God. If you're a child, you would think of My Book of Bible Stories, number 10. If you're not familiar with the My Book of Bible Stories, well, then I just tell you Genesis chapter 6. And immediately, if I tell you Genesis chapter 6, you will equate the flood in Noah's day with an act of God. So let's turn there. Genesis chapter 6, and we will look at verse 5. See this act of God. See if it lines up with those criteria. Genesis 6:5, it says, consequently, Jehovah saw the badness of man was abundant in the earth, and every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only bad all the time. Verse 12, so God saw the earth, and look, it was ruined, because all flesh had ruined its way on the earth. So, this was the situation. The world of mankind suffered a general moral breakdown. All of his inclinations bad all the time. The earth, it says in verse 11, had become filled with violence. Lives were completely devoted to pursuing material or sexual desires. Hence, God, who was the landlord or the creator of the earth, determined to wipe wicked humans off the earth by bringing a global disaster. As the landlord, he was fully justified in so doing. However, God took note of one man and his family, Noah. He promised them safety during the coming destruction if they obeyed his instructions. Here's what the Bible says about Noah in verse 22 of that chapter. Noah proceeded to do according to all that God had commanded of him. He did just so. Noah was different from the people around him. Noah walked with the true God. So, how is it that we can say that this disaster, this act of God, fit into those criteria that we already listed? Number one, it was in harmony with God's purpose. Yes, it was. He determined he was going to remove wicked man. Number two, preceded by advance warning. Yes, it was. He gave Noah specific instructions. They weren't general, they were specific. How he could survive. And, well, actually, that was more number three, because that was the divine instructions for survival. Number two, preceded by advance warning. Yes, he gave him warning of what he was going to do. what it says about that event in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5. Let's turn that together. 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 5. It says, he did not hold back from punishing an ancient world, but kept Noah, a preacher of righteousness, safe with 7 others when he brought a deluge upon a world of ungodly people. Yes, advance warning was given by Noah for many years. That generation refused to believe. They had never seen a flood before. You gotta be kidding. Flood? Never heard of this. My grandfather never even heard of such a thing. So, as the time went on, the warning fell on deaf ears. They took no note. It did not matter that the warning came from their Creator through Noah. So this was an act of God that did take place. Let's look at another act. If you were in the My Book of Bible Stories, you turn to story 15. That is the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. How is it that we can say this was an act of God? Well, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were depraved. The people were unrighteous. They did not follow God's instruction. And so, Jehovah God determined he would destroy the city. However, he did take note of Lot. Lot, even though he couldn't even find 10 righteous people in the whole city, he took note of Lot and his righteous ways. And so he determined that he would preserve Lot and his family when he destroyed that city. That was just how